the United States convinces Diem to stop the elections in 1956 because it becomes obvious that if they do hold the election, that Ho Chi Minh would be elected, and that would mean that Vietnamese would become communist, and that's something that the United States doesn't want to allow, and so they stop the elections, and as a result of that, the North Vietnamese claim that the South has broken the deal that they made at the Geneva Accords, and they invade South Vietnam, right? And so then the South Vietnam is going to be fighting a war against North Vietnam. And at the same time, there's the development of another group in South Vietnam called the National Liberation Front, otherwise known as the Viet Cong. And the Viet Cong are going to be communist sympathizers who are allied with North Vietnam. So not only are they fighting a war against the North Vietnamese army, which is being supplied by the Chinese and the Russians, but they're also fighting a guerrilla war against the Viet Cong, who are not recognizable because they don't have, they're not an established force. They're just terrorists, essentially, right? You guys are with me? Questions, comments? All right, okay. So what's going to happen then is there will be so much unrest in Vietnam, South Vietnam, that Ngo Dinh Diem will be basically lose control of the country, and the United States will start looking for an alternative to Diem because they want to establish a government in Vietnam that would be popular enough to defeat Ho Chi Minh. As it happens, there is no alternative to Diem because Diem has removed all of his opposition, and so what ends up happening then is that the United States is faced with a dilemma. If they abandon Diem, then there's a real chance that the South would fall to communism, which would be seen as a blow to American Cold War strategy. All right, or I should say, if they abandon the government of Vietnam, but if they don't intervene in Vietnam, it's going to be obvious that that the South will fall. You guys follow what I'm saying? So now there's going to be a coup conspiracy led by generals of the South Vietnamese army, which the idea was that they went to President Kennedy, and proposed to him that they would get rid of Diem and they'd establish a new government with a new president. And Kennedy endorsed that plan with the caveat that when the generals took over, that they would just get rid of Diem and they wouldn't hurt anybody else. Well, what ends up happening is that the generals take over and they kill Diem and his whole family, right? And at this point then, Kennedy orders a review of American policy in Vietnam. And some people will argue that he was ready to abandon Vietnam. I don't think that that's true, but at least that's what people will say. We don't know that whether or not it's true because before the review was finished, Kennedy had been killed, right? At any rate, questions or comments so far? So now we have basically Vietnam with almost no government, and they're on the verge of collapse based on the movements of the North Vietnamese army and also the Viet Cong. Okay, you guys are with me? Questions, comments? And up to this point, the Americans have been supporting the South Vietnamese, and one of the ways that they did that was by blockading the approach to North Vietnam with the American Navy, right? What's going to end up happening is that there's going to be, or I should say it this way, that the United States is looking for an alternative, a way to intervene in Vietnam. And that incident is going to happen here in 1963 and excuse me, in 1964, in what's August of 1964, which is in an incident called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Okay, this is the Gulf of Tonkin right here. And what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin was that there was an American destroyer, the Maddox, which was patrolling. And in fact, they were doing more than just patrolling. They were actually supporting South Vietnamese military activity in North Vietnam. But they reported that they had been attacked, by two gunboats. And then the following, I think 2 days later, they reported that they were being under attack from some radar, whatever they call them on radar, that they could see an attack coming on radar. And as it later turned out, there were actually American airplanes in the sky at the time, and the American pilots reported there was no activity. So whatever that the sailors on the Maddox saw, it probably wasn't an attack. But nevertheless, the report of the attack is going to be enough to convince President Johnson to ask the United States Congress to for money to start to oppose communism in North Vietnam. So this is going to be called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, right? That basically what ends up happening is Johnson asks for money to fight against communism in Vietnam. The Congress is basically going to give him a blank check saying whatever it takes, okay? And I want you guys to know this, that in 1964, when the United States declared that it was going to send troops to Vietnam, the American people were almost 100% behind it, okay? The resolution in Congress to provide funds to fight the war in Vietnam was almost unanimous. There was only one abstention, okay? You guys get me here? So the reason why it's important for me to point this out is because in 1964, 1965, Americans are all for the war in Vietnam. But by 1968, Americans are going to be all against it. And we're going to wonder why, okay? And we'll talk about that on a different day, okay? Questions, comments so far? All right, so then the United States then introduces troops. They start actually a bombing campaign called Operation Rolling Thunder, which is going to continue to drop bombs on North Vietnam for basically the next 10 years, right? Almost continuously. And at the same time, eventually the United States introduced troops. And by July of 1965, there's 100,000 American troops. And then by 1968, there's almost 500,000 American troops in South Vietnam, okay? With the idea being that they were going to try to stop communism in Vietnam.